All right, we're glad to see some folks got up and walked around a little bit. So moving into the next, email marketing. So we're actually getting into a little more channel specific, which I think is nice because now we can start to get in a little more nitty gritty. And I also think some folks will probably have more very specific directed questions as well. So similar thing, right? Obviously, like, you know who I am, one bit of new information. I can juggle 3 balls. So just so at least you're learning something new about me as we're going into here. But yeah, so again, some space for some specific, because again, I got some general things that I think are applicable to a wide range of skills and experience and things like that. But also pretty happy to let's get a real nitty gritty dirty question. And definitely there are some advanced things that I'm pretty happy to talk about in terms of behavioral segmentations or ways you can use RSS feeds to automate and all this sorts of talk nerdy to me sort of stuff, right? So again, what's the problems to be solved here? So one is just what are best practices around email, and then what does it play sort of in your overall campaigns? So a little bit of sort of how we'll arrive at all that and where we're going to go. So again, a bit of this, some resources, and hopefully some conversations, and another activity we'll work through because I think it's helpful for people to, again, get into the details of you and your organization. So why email matters. Who here actually hates email? Nobody wants to admit it? I despise email. It pains me to have to dig through it, but it's also a pretty critical part of what I do to just function at my job. It's also a very important and powerful way that we connect with people, right? So again, this is one of those things where we're here talking about something in the professional sphere. So whether you personally like it or not is somewhat detached from the fact of is it an effective tool for what you're trying to do and accomplish your mission, right? So just as we talk about social media, email tends to be one of those things where there may be some personal emotions we might need to separate in order to talk about how we use these strategically. So what I'm doing here in this section is, again, sharing some details. They're in the printed slides. I know the foundation is also going to make available an electronic version of the full slides so that you can read the whole thing. So a bit of this information. So part of what I'm also trying to imply, though, is that in particular around email, there's a lot of resources, a lot of research, and a lot of data that's happening out there. And because it is one of the oldest channels, right, there's some good history. And there's also some stuff that's very specific to the nonprofit sector, which is really nice. Because when you go and you look into some of the other newer tools, like SMS campaigns and stuff like that, there might start to be some data, but it's not very often that it's super specific to the nonprofit sector. And certainly not specific to arts and culture organizations within the nonprofit sector. So one of the things about email that's nice is you can start to get to that granular level because it's been around forever. It's such a core part of how we communicate. So email is still super effective. I mean, no one's going to give you some really good tips on how you can become more effective on some of these other channels like Facebook and things like that with advertising. But just the reality that over time, some of these social channels have become what they were always destined to be, right? The whole goal of an online-based business model is build your base, get all the users in, and then you figure out how to monetize them. So that sort of happened in Facebook, right? So as they changed their algorithm, it has ratcheted down what your reach was, right? So you got 1,000 people following your page. You used to, every time you shared a post, it would go out and it'd be seen by 50, 60% of those people. You're now living in a realm where that now reaches about 2%. So even if there's 1,000 that like your page, you share a post, maybe 2 are going to see it in their feed. Anyhow. So email is still a thing that gets high open rates, it gets high follow through, right? So you'll see what some of these sort of benchmarked open rates are. So of a lot of the channels, it still gets some of the highest levels of engagement and conversion. Right? Conversion sounds like this terrible marketing word, but we need to own it. That's the reality of what we're trying to do, right? I want anybody here have a mission that says, I want people to visit my website? And that's it. They can stop there and I feel like I've changed the world. No, you want them to do something else. We're trying to convert behavior into particular actions. So as you can see, right, that there's just a lot of data still supporting the fact that email plays this really, really keystone role in digital communications and getting to people to convert actions. Return on investment, again, because it has been around for a long time. So here's an example, sort of typically the way data rolls out. In terms of the proportion of people you have on your different channels, like different social channels versus how many people you have on your list, we have more people, i.e. more opportunity to connect through our email lists. Does this feel true for most folks? You feel like there's more people on your email list than directly connected on other channels? Is folks raising hands?
Not after what you said about Facebook a few seconds ago. It used to be a great return with Facebook, but then this last year it's switched.
It's switched. There's definitely strategies that, okay, if this is what it's switched to, then we just need to use the tool differently. But it's certainly fine, I think, to own that like Facebook is not what it was 5 years ago. The same strategies are not going to get you anywhere near the same impact. So you just have to own it and treat it for what it is. I think groups are still this amazing bastion that has not been sort of brought along with the rest of the platform yet. But that is going to change very soon. And the reason I know is because Facebook is advertising groups to me, which means it's on their radar that that's a place that they want me so that I can then start moving into. But they're still good. They're still solid in terms of old type of engagement you used to get that has shifted on pages and things like that. So I think this is just helpful to note, again, because there's a lot of excitement around these other things, especially channels where it's very conversational. Again, this just reminder, highest return on investment, right? We continue to see growth in lists, right? There's definitely some attrition. There's definitely people that unsubscribe from lists. And people always look at that as like a super negative, and I think it's important to pay attention to. But I also think it's important to think of, again, you know, be it Facebook, be it an email list, 1,000 people that don't actually take the action you care about isn't worth as much as 10 people who do the thing, right? So whenever we have these, I think as long as you're being strategic in building this, right, adding new people that are a good fit for what you're about and trying to do is great. And people that select out is actually fine, because guess what? They weren't the fit. They weren't going to be answering the calls to action anyways. So I would rather encourage people to have smaller, more meaningful engagement than thinking of those vanity metrics. I like to call them, right? People are like, well, how many followers on your page? It's like, that actually doesn't mean anything. How many people engage meaningfully through your page? Great. And again, there's some spots where really small organizations are crushing it compared to larger organizations because they're just chasing vanity metrics. We did a big campaign and we got 15,000 more likes on our page. And yet we're no further to our mission and no one else came to volunteer and all that. So I think it's helpful to think email continues to grow and continues to have this presence. It's definitely not on a decline, I would say. Again, that commercial, we talked about it before. So not only is this an understanding of how the tool is used, but this is also, I think, the number one tip and suggestion for how you think about the content you're going to be putting in your email stuff. I may send it to 1,000 people, but on the other end, it's an individual. So what's built in and implied there is when you're writing your content for your email, don't write it to 10,000 people. Write an email to an individual, because that's who's going to read it on the other end. So this also loops back and reinforces why it's important to think about groups. It's important to think about segmenting and sending different emails to different groups, right? Because if I'm talking to you as a volunteer, that's a different message that I'm going to have to someone who was a first-time donor a year ago and gave $20. If I try and write the same email that comes to each of those individuals, you're going to get a half-hearted miss with both. Whereas two separate emails that goes to those groups, I'm probably actually going to have a pretty good connection in what they're seeing and what they're reading. So this sounds really simple, but I would encourage you, go back, read your newsletters, read your emails that you've sent out. Did you write them to an individual or did you write them to the list? Because most people are surprised. They're like, oh, of course, that's what you're supposed to, that's what we did. Oh, I guess not. I started it with hello community. I guess that wasn't to an individual. All right, so there's just a little bit. Again, like you can make yourself crazy going out and digging into data and reports, and I definitely share some of those resources at the end, but I don't want to keep sort of hammering it here and using your time for that. So I wanted to jump in, like what are the anatomy of an email plan? Because again, there's a lot of people here. How many people feel like you send email and you do the thing, but it's not necessarily like you've got a plan or a strategy. It's like, well, of course we send out email. Everybody sends out email. This is what we do. So hopefully this gives you at least like a framework, again, a structure for how you can sort of build out a base level plan to use towards Give More 24, but also just in general. So the first thing is defining your audience. Again, we've heard this a couple times. Hopefully it'll stick. So again, this is going back to those two models, how you want to define your audience. In the realm of email, this also starts to go down that rabbit hole of segmentation. Anybody here, who wants to define sort of segmentation at a real basic level? So we hear some other voices besides mine today.
Like interests?
Like and interests?
Yeah, like.
Yep. So there's one way, right, that organizations can create
For me, it's my
segmentation.
classes. You know, I work with the school district foundation, so I can actually peer every graduating class against each other.
So it's a way to group the larger group into smaller groups that you would ultimately tailor messages to, right?
Board members, large donors,
Yep.
volunteers.
Yep. What's another, anybody else here do segmentation? What's another way that you sort of, you split things up?
Well, you had a group of people who donated last month to one event that you did. Maybe you don't want to ask them again, so you'll kind of, like, you won't send out the emails to them this month.
Recent donors, right? Everyone likes to say one-time donors, two-time donors. But again, you got an event in August. You don't want to send those people the same email you're sending to someone that gave a year ago, but you haven't seen since then. Right? So some examples of ways we've already laid out based on people's interests. You see this on websites. We do this on ours at N10. Come in, create a user profile. Part of what you do is you indicate what your interest areas are. I'm into these topics. We've got donations, some behavior patterns. We've got roles. So for us, we also ask people for their titles. We then create segmentations based on that. So if we're going to run a training for marketing communication folks, let's send that email to people who work in marketing and communications. It's probably not going to land too well if we send it to the IT director, right? So those are all some pretty straightforward. I think we all have data that we can probably break into some of those various segments. Something I just want to drop as a thing to be aware of, and if you're at that level, definitely worth going and digging deeper into, but I'm not going to get too into the weeds on it, but behavioral segmentation. So what this means is I want to send this email to everyone who opened the last email. I want to send this email to everyone who opened the last one and clicked through to the website versus this one to people who opened it but didn't click the link. And then that third, I'm going to send this email to the people who didn't even open the last one. So there's a lot of tools now that are evolving pretty quickly, you know, MailChimp and some of these that are allowing you to do more of that behavioral segmentation. And that has a much higher return because again, you're basing it on people's actions. And it implies that you were actually listening and paid attention to what I did. Hey, you know, it looks like you're interested in this topic. We don't quite have you down on the list to show up at the event. We just want to make sure you got the reminder for the save the date. Oh, okay, cool. You clearly know I'm interested, but you also know I'm not registered yet. There's nothing like getting an email that's like, hey, remember to register. It's like, I already did. And you didn't even notice. You didn't even pay attention. So I dropped that again. Like you can go down a pretty big rabbit hole. But I think like some of the other stuff I mentioned, it's good to point out because some of the tools you are currently on right now, this might have been a feature that rolled out in the last year or two and you just weren't even aware of. Some of you might have that functionality just sitting there waiting to be used. And what's nice about those that I love is you can kind of automate, right? So I can say, I'm going to write these messages all now. And I'm just going to schedule, and the system will know, send this follow-up email a week after they opened it. So I don't have to manually go back and do that thing. Because as a small team, I don't have time for that business. But the system will help me. The tool will actually help me do it. So I pointed out, because if you're at that level, it's something great to go to next steps, or you can send me an email after this and like we can go to nerdy levels with it. If you're not at that level, right, you'll remember nothing. Don't be overwhelmed. Don't feel like you have to do it, but know that it is a path forward for those that are at that point. So next step in developing your email plan, right? Know what your content is ahead of time. How many people are like, I got to do the email? You sit down and at that moment you just start making it up as you're going for it. Then you fire that thing out the next day, right? Hopefully someone else gave it a quick proofread. But like, that's our process. So knowing ahead of time, what do we include in our emails? All right, we obviously include pictures. We include some links. Oh, and there's an opportunity to volunteer. So before I ever sit down to start writing my email, I probably need to make sure I have a system in place to know where I can be grabbing some images. I've got a place that I know I'm going to send them to sign up to volunteer. Right? Like again, the planning ahead. I know I have these things. So when I come to write the email, like this is actually really easy because I've already built out my things. I've already used what Nolan taught me about InfoSnaps to know that I actually have to create that and send that to the other person on my team who's in charge of writing the email before she hits her deadline. I got to create that thing over here the week prior. Frequency and goals. Again, like I put the slide in, I think this is helpful. It will be slightly different when you're putting this in the particular context of a single day giving event, right? Because if you're thinking about an overall newsletter, there's different frequency, right? Like, are we going to send this thing once a month, once a week, every 2 weeks? The one general tip I'd say is that in terms of like regular communications, I wouldn't say any less than a month. I mean, imagine like how close are you to friends that you talk to once a quarter? Not that close. Right? So if you want to use your communications to build those relationships, I'd say monthly is probably where it should be. And again, it doesn't have to be massive. Quick note, quick bit of information just keeps people on your radar. But again, frequency, fitting it into that timeline for the overall campaign plan, right? 2-3 weeks out, I want to be sort of priming people. Hey, we're heading towards the event. Here's some sample copy you can help share out and help getting your community excited as well and building all that. Versus when we get into the week, like I might send an email every 2 days during the week leading up to it to really get people ramped up. I'm not going to send people an email every 2 days for the entire year. That'd be nuts, right? For the few days beforehand, I might. So the next thing, this always comes up, schedule, day and time. Again, there's stacks of data out there, and there are some general rules of thumb, right? Tuesdays and Thursdays are generally better days. Middle of the day, I mean, it makes sense. Think about you and your day. When do you want to check email? I get in and I always open it first thing, and then I give a big sigh, and I'm like, man, how'd I get 50 emails last night after I went to sleep? This is crazy. And then when do you actually dig in and actually do something with your emails? Probably somewhere afternoon, after you've had your morning meetings, you've gotten grinding, and now you're really working. Or if you're like me, noon every 3 days is when you can catch up. So, I mean, there are some general things, right? Between 10 and 1, Tuesdays and Thursdays. These are general rules, though. It really does depend on you and your community. So at N10, what are we? We're an organization that serves other organizations. When do you think about us? When you're at your job. So weekdays is going to be the right time to send you an email. If I work with volunteers, do I connect with them at their jobs? Not really. They tend to think of us more on the weekends because that's when they might volunteer. That's when they're going to come out and be our volunteer naturalist. That's where we're going to do this sort of stuff. So your times to reach out to people might actually be Friday afternoon as people are thinking about and planning what they're doing on their weekend. Right? So again, some of your email platform tools actually have some reporting in there that might be able to give you a hint at like when is your community actually opening the emails? So while there's some general guidelines, I would definitely encourage you to take the time to pay attention to your community, because it might be different than this global benchmarky sort of stuff. But the reality is, like 9 o'clock on Monday morning is probably the death spiral. That is a terrible time to send something to people. And so using the scheduling tool is always important, because typically, like when you're writing and you're doing this thing at your job, it simply happens to be when you had time to do it at your job. Don't immediately hit send and fire it out simply because I got to get on to the next thing, right? Think about when you want it scheduled to happen, to go out. So as you're going into campaigns, there are certain emails you know you're going to want to send. You could write that thing today and know that it's actually going to go out on September 21st. So in that planning and thinking ahead, right, like don't make life harder for yourself than it needs to be. Don't imagine that if these are the emails we want to send, I have to write them on that day. That's ridiculous. Do it now. Have them in the queue, have them ready to go, have the shell built out and be like, all I need to do is come in, drop in this graphic, and this one's ready to go. But right now you've got some breathing space, be a little calmer, you've got time to reread it 2 days later with fresh eyes, stuff like that. So think about that, because the scheduling is another thing that I see gets missed a lot of times by organizations. Just be like, okay, it's done, send. That really doesn't work out usually. So I'm going to get you into another activity. We're dipping a little bit. So we're going to get you focused back on you. So you'll see in the worksheet, there's some spaces here where, again, I want you to really think about these elements again. Audience, again, you can use this to pull back to what we did in the last session. What were the groups you identified? Or you can choose to focus on sort of segmentation is the way you want to think about how you're grouping this. Donors that gave in the last 6 months. Donors that gave in the last year. Volunteers that have been active in the last 6 months. Right? So I don't think we're going to go full 10 minutes, but this one I think will definitely take a little more thinking. And there's a few more sections than the last one. So definitely want to give you some time to work through this, because I think I want this to be your biggest tangible as you head out of this session. And I'll cruise around and I'm happy to answer questions and stuff as you're digging into this. But I just want you to be aware and have some space to think about this. Because otherwise all the tips and suggestions sort of don't have any context. They won't matter as much. All right, it looks like we're getting a lot of folks that are pretty close. So we'll just give it like 1 more minute to wrap up this part. So just to help reiterate some of the questions or stuff that people were asking. So not directly related to the plan, but the question came up, like how much does it help if you want people to share on social channels and stuff like that? Like, does it make a difference if you give them examples? And I can say, absolutely. 100% of the time, we see a noticeable difference between saying, hey, make sure you share this opportunity, versus when we say, here's 3 sample tweets, here's 2 sample Facebook posts, and here's a blurb you can put in your newsletter. If we give people samples, people will share it. If we don't, it almost never happens. And we have a pretty large active community at N10, right?
In the email, right?
In the email, so like as you're leading up to it, that idea of like, well, for the example back there, an arts organization, right? They want to start reaching out to parents further ahead of the event than they necessarily would, say, people that donated once last year and they gave $20. So the parents, they want them to play the champion role. So by reaching out 2-3 weeks ahead of time and saying, here's some sample tweets, they likely will share that. Or here's something you can pass along. So just saying, like from our experience and what the research shows, being clear what you want them to do and then making it as insanely easy as possible gets you results. And just speaking from my experience in the last 2 years with N10, we give them the easy route, it happens every time. We don't, it almost never happens. And I understand too, because I'm on the other end. People will ask me to promote something, and if they don't give me a blip, it means I've got to stop and I've got to go find the page and find the link and then craft I just kind of don't. Not because I don't like them, I don't have time to do that in the middle of all the other stuff I was doing today. So there was just a thing that came up at a conversation that I think is helpful for everyone to know. And then you can craft those now and have them ready to go out 2 weeks before the event. You don't have to wait till then to get it sorted. All right, so the next thing I want to do on this is, again, I am a fan, and again, this note, this is not a final doc. So I'm happy to pass back to the foundation to share out electronic versions of the worksheet as well. I'll just give them a Word doc, because in case you want to take this back and work with your teams or something like that, like you can definitely use these, give you an electronic format, all that kind of stuff. So feel like these are just working notes. You can mark these things up, all that kind of stuff. So again, I want you to take a moment to talk to someone else who's not from your organization to talk through your plan a little bit. So some suggestions, conversation primers, like an element, something that you wrote down. And for this one, like what was particularly hard and what was particularly easy about trying to lay out this email plan. Feel free to ask questions. All right, so ooh, that slide washed out. Just a couple of quick examples. So again, there's lots, and you'll see them through the tips and resources. But some examples that, again, I think worth learning from at various stages of sort of this email life cycle. So sign up. Here's an example, Malaria No More. Anybody heard of this organization? Again, this is one I absolutely would encourage you. Go to their website, sign up for their newsletter, sign up for their stuff, just as a place to learn. They show up as examples for me all the times in trainings. So this email came to me as a way to get me to solicit to sign up for something on their site. So, you know, because of another interaction I had with them of doing a donation, which to be honest was a $1 donation, then led me to get into here and them getting me to sign up for some other stuff. So I like this. It's got an image. It's what they want. They want me to join them, which is very inclusive. Like, we want you to be a part of our story, a part of our cause. And then it's not a donate button. It's a Save a Life Now button. It's clear what it is they want me to do. It's clear when they want me to do it. And they didn't take a paragraph to try and spell it out. They used 4 words. So I really like this in terms of being compelling. And again, like that right there on that slide, that's the entire email. There isn't a whole bunch of other stuff. Right now, this is the most important thing for us, so we kept it to just this here. See this all the time with organizations. To be honest, this is one of the things I think we do a pretty terrible job of on the N10 website right now, is we have call to action pages. We want you to register an event. We want you to come to our conference. And on the same page, we will have roughly 15 other things you can click on, which are all very interesting because we work hard to make them interesting. So what happens is we get you going around here. Ultimately, I just wanted you to come here and do this thing today. So I'd encourage you, in your sign up, that's what you want them to do. You get to your ask later, you get to the next step later. This is the first part of dating, right? Get me on the date before we start talking about second dates and getting a house and all that kind of stuff, right? So call to action. I like this. Again, a lot of times they have really compelling visuals. I actually chose this on purpose as an example because this is all text. So really small organizations don't have time to do a bunch of graphics, all this. Like, you feel like I can just put some text. Again, this is an entire email, 2 links that actually go to the same place. There was multiple opportunities for me to get to the spot that I wanted. But again, super concise. What do they want me to do? They want me to sign a petition. They do 100 things, but today this is all they're talking to me about because this is what they want me to do. And when I follow that link on the other end, it's just a page to sign a petition. And then they share the impact, all that loops up, right? Their follow-up is really great. But I like this because, again, anybody, if you're first time writing some bulk emails, like, you can get some words and you can provide some links. Again, much like social media, email is meant to get you somewhere else. If you're sending out an update email that doesn't link them to somewhere else, like, there can still be some value in it, But usually what you're trying to do is get someone to this other destination. So make sure that's clear in the email. So that's a good tip for newsletters and all that stuff as well. The thank you. Anybody heard Charity Water? They've done pretty well. Their CEO used to be a club promoter. He understands how to get the word out, how to create buzz and all that, right? So they're very good at their storytelling, about incorporating some visuals. So this is a longer email, but showing, right? Image up front. Here's the impact. Thank you. And then they include some stories. So these are people in the community that are part of what you're doing, and this is sort of the tangibles about how individuals are just as much a part of the story. So I think it's helpful because a lot of orgs will get this. They'll get the here's the impact, here's a thank you, but you miss the opportunity to say, by the way, this is your story as much as it's ours, and trying to make that real. Turn it into other humans that I can relate to, right? Ultimately, you need me to say, I see myself in your story. I am part of it. So they do a really great job, again, of doing this in lots of different ways, but in their email, they're very good about having simple, clean visuals. That's just an icon, right? You can find those things for free. But I have that, I have a couple of sentences, and that whole thing right there, that's a story. So when you think of these things, they seem overwhelming and dumb. We don't have a photographer. We don't have a graphic designer. It'll take you 2 seconds to find that icon in the Google. And it'll be totally legal to use. And it won't take you that long to write the 2 sentences. But again, if you were intentional and strategic, it will have impact. So follow up, I like Splash. They do a great job of really making their impact clear. So in their emails especially, right? So again, not super complicated graphics, but effective visual storytelling. There's an image that's complemented by text. It's not competing. Like sometimes you'll get this quote and it's a pretty picture, and then after a second you're like, those things don't actually connect and relate though, right? So Splash is another organization I think does a really good job of after the event, after the campaign, they continue to share updates and information with you. So there's just a couple of examples. To be honest, as I jump into the next section here, these are chock full of other resources and places to go and get data and examples and all that stuff as well. So don't be spammy. So the reality is this isn't nonprofits. This is like email at large. 97% of it ends up in spam and is gone. So the amount of stuff you get and you think like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. You're getting about 3% of the garbage that has been fired at you. So again, the little things you can do to get and build trust with people in their system. So real simple, and I know some orgs that have done this, right? They'll have an email campaign where you simply send out an email and ask people to reply to it answering a simple question. It's fun, it's a little quick engaging thing and all that. This is a tactic to deal with spam filters. If I have replied to an email address, my system now knows that I trust that thing. So in the future, when they send emails from that email address, the system is less likely to dump it into, if you're in Gmail, it's less likely to show up in a promotions tab or something like that because they've replied to me in the past. There's little things you can do to help build that trust, but the biggest thing you can do is build trust with that individual. Share good content, the kind of content they want in a way that makes sense and adds value for them, and you'll find that you beat all the spam filter stuff. Because they respond, they click on links, they do these things, and they want to open your emails. So things, what are those obvious fouls? We talked about some of these. Don't try and send bulk email out of Outlook. Don't skip the opt-in. I'll get this all the time because I interact with lots of orgs in different ways. If I start getting the newsletter and I know at no point, like, I think I met you at a conference and you asked me a question and I gave you a business card and now you've dropped me in your email list. Like technically, you might fall within that like referred realm of CAN spam laws of like we had an interaction so legally I can add you. I didn't opt in. So the first thing I do is opt out. And you only hope I took the time to click on the unsubscribe button at the bottom, because guess what? It's a whole lot easier to just click the spam button and know that you're never coming back into my box. So take the time to think about how someone got to your list. Did they want to be on your list to receive this type of communication? If not, you're not going to find a win on the other end, even if you legally got it through. So make sure you're thinking about that. Avoid shortened links and emails. So this is like Bitly, things like that. Like it's gotten a little bit better, but what that looks like in email is that you're trying to hide the final destination. And sometimes we do it because we're like, well, I don't want to drop a long URL in. Well, put a link some text, learn more. Link that. Don't drop a full URL, because what happens is when you drop that, that's a pretty classic spam tactic for spammers to use, to have a link that says, go to your bank account. And it's a shortened URL, so it's masking what the final destination is. So that's definitely something that will get you flagged. I remember a couple years ago, I tried an experiment where I was like, I'm going to use a Bitly link to see how many people click on this link in my email signature. It'll be cool to get some data. And it was like, instantly, I was in like spam filters, and I wasn't making it through. And I was like, oh man, I thought I was going to get some metrics. Turns out I set off every flag. So sometimes it's harmless, but just be aware that tucking those in can definitely cause some trouble. Extremely long subject lines. I'll show you a little bit about what it means, but it's like don't try and put a paragraph in a subject line. It looks like a lot of the spam that comes through, right? It's just sort of random, rambling garbage. Much like the opt-in, like if they didn't really want to be on your newsletter list, don't put them there. Because again, it's super easy in any email program to mark something as spam and know it's going away forever. And those add up. Like I've had people that have been told by their bulk email platform, like, we don't want to work with you anymore because you're ruining our reputation sending through our systems because you keep getting marked as spam, so we're going to shut you down.
You mentioned earlier getting a special email because you put a reply to email when you build these, and you mentioned getting a special email address that had a special domain name rather than something common like Gmail or something. And I know that was an issue I had with Benchmark Email. The tech support people suggested that I get an email that had a special domain name to use as a reply name. So is that another reason that emails end up in spam?
Absolutely.
Okay.
To be honest, if I'm sending a bulk email coming from a Gmail account, it looks suspicious. So all the more reason to have that branded organization domain name that it's coming from. Some platforms won't even let you do it. They'll be like, nope, that's a Hotmail email. You can't use that. Like I think MailChimp now has that in place where they won't let you drop a Gmail as the to and the from. Because they know it'll make them look like they're sending spam and they're not interested in allowing that. So yeah, that'll definitely catch you. So ultimately, right, there are lots of metrics, and we could really go into it. At a base level, these are the ones that really matter. Getting it open, getting people to click the links that go through. So there's a little formula of what these sort of mean. So click-through rate. So out of how many people opened this thing up and sort of saw it, how many of those people clicked through, and that gives you sort of that ratio score you'll see in the back end. And then again, opening. It doesn't matter how many people you send things to. If I send it to 10,000, but for some reason I'm only getting 20 people to open it, there's only 20 people that are actually getting my message anyways. So some things here, like does the length of the subject line matter? It used to be honest, 5 years ago, a lot of email, like Gmail and things where people are reading and opening things up, right? They would truncate your message at like 33, 35 characters. If you had long subject lines, people wouldn't open it. And given the shift that email now happens, 70% of email is opened the first time on a mobile device, right? The world has just shifted. So here's some recent research showing there's definitely some sweet spots, right? Somewhere between 30 and 50 characters is where sort of you're finding your happy spot. But ultimately, in terms of the read rate, like people opening it up, it doesn't vary that much between the length. So general global benchmarks, length of the subject line doesn't matter that much. I do think that shorter, more concise, to the point what it is people can expect by opening it still does have an impact on getting it open. You know, this is like private sector, commerce sector, this is like everything. But just think about it, like when you're scanning your list of emails, how do you decide what to open now? Do you trust who it came from is a big one? Is it clear what they want when I open this up? So I definitely say I'm a fan of the shorter, more concise. If it's looking truncated, my assumption is if there's a lot of information in your subject line, there's probably a lot of content in your email, and I don't have the time to dig through it right now. Here's some data around sort of reasons from users that report why they open it. You know, specifically around, the first one is the sender's name. So again, as you're setting up your bulk thing and you're going through the setup settings and you're just moving real quick, it asks for the from email address and it asks for the from name. Think about what you're putting from the from name, because it really does, that's the number one thing that's going to make me decide if I want to open this thing. So again, some people just put info, it's from info. I don't want anything from info, but I would love something from you as a person, or I would love something from your organization. But just putting volunteer or info or something like that as the from name, it's terrible. So this is another spot to work in your branding. Do people know you? Don't drop an acronym in the from name. I don't want to open an email from an acronym. I want to open it from something I have a relationship with. So other things. Here's some other things you can tweak and you can think about in terms of getting open rates to improve. Again, this ultimately comes down to knowing your community, learning and listening. So again, you're never going to know which of these is helping, or if you made a change, if it's helping. If you don't take the time to check out your metrics, just because it's in the system, if you don't ever go back and actually look at not just the open rate for this email, but like, is this better than average for us? Is this worse? Like again, take the time to learn and pay attention, and then these are some things you can work on. Again, call to action. I know this doesn't always work, but I do like this in terms of a campaign context. This is the one, the Malaria No More. Power of one, that's what one means. $1 equals one treatment for malaria equals one life saved. So it worked very well. I gave them a total of $3, and they continued to share the story of how that meant I actually saved 3 lives. So as the medication shipped a week later, they let me know, here's an email, your medication's leaving the States and it's heading for Kenya. A couple days later, it's arrived, we're now heading to the villages. 3 weeks later, it's here at the villages, here's some pictures of the kids that you helped save. Like this amazing experience, I gave them $3. Most organizations won't even allow me to give $3. It's got to be $10 or above. So again, and it was super clear. So this doesn't always work. There are other times where I'm like, I don't want to tie it to a specific. I just know that the work you're doing can't be quantified by like really direct things. But if the work you do does, this can really help. And this is a graphic that shows up in an email. Imagine how many words they'd have to use to try and explain this if they didn't use graphics. More than I'm willing to read. So understanding, right, social media websites, we all like visual because we're storytelling creatures as humans, right? Email's no different. These graphics you create on social channels, they can be repurposed and they can live again in emails and things like that. So as you head into your other training sessions, just keep all that in mind. Right, what to expect. We always say, click here. I don't know what's going to happen if I click there. Because if I don't know now, I might not put in the effort to actually click it. So again, making that clear is really helpful. 2 simple things around testing. So the one that everyone can do, always send yourself that test email. Because it might look good in the editing screen, and then all of a sudden when it pops through, you're like, oh my gosh, the preview of the subject line is terrible. oh, I didn't realize that I had some like garbled business as the alt text on the image, which doesn't show up in the editor thing, but I rolled my mouse over when it popped up in my email, even if it was by accident, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, use this picture for the email. You know, like I didn't realize that was going to show up when it gets to someone's account. So always send that one. This takes no technical skill. It takes about an extra minute, 2 minutes to just check and make sure how it's looking. So this one again gets to a little bit more advanced, but a lot of your existing platforms will actually allow you to do this. So this is a simple A/B test. So what it is like, say you've got a list of 1,000 people. I'll have 2 versions of a subject line. And so I'll send one email to 10 people. I'll send the other one to 10 other people. Whichever one gets the better open rate, that's the one I will pick to send to the full list. Right? So this is already built into a lot of your existing platforms. One of those things like you might already be able to do it. You just didn't know it. So this is, again, it's a great way, like, let's run a quick test before we send this to everybody. And the system can automate. You can load up your 2 samples, and as soon as the winner is decided, it will send the winner out to your full list for you. But this is great. We do this all the time, and we find it's just huge impact. Again, what does our community respond to? Tell us, and then what do you know? We'll give you that.
How many examples were you saying for A and for B?
You only ever do 2. Like you just want to test one variable.
Or how many people?
It depends. I mean, at a certain level, if you've only got 50 people on your list, you're not going to run an A/B test. It doesn't make any sense. You just try this subject line this time and try a slightly different one next time. There's definitely, the bigger the list, the more valuable this is, right? Because your small sample groups will actually have more people in them. So there is some scale to this approach. Personalized. We talked a little bit about this. So this is the last one before I get to some resources here at the end real quick. Massive impact from seeing Dear Ash versus Dear Friend, right? Or community member, or just straight up skipping it. So the more you can personalize, the better, right? For those that have donor databases and are a little more sophisticated, hey Ash, we really appreciate the $20 donation you made last December. Like if you can get to that, like that's great. Like, oh, okay, so you actually remember me. But at a very base level, simply having my first name at the top of the email, again, lets me know I'm receiving a personal communication. And you can see the data supports like massive increase in people engaging with those as soon as it's personalized in any way. So getting it open, getting the clicks, like it really does matter. So again, when you're setting it up and you've got that form and there's the option to include first name, I would encourage you to do it at the very least. Get a name, get an email address. The more you collect, the more you can segment and personalize, but you don't want to go crazy, right? You don't need 20 things from me just so I can sign up for your newsletter. But the other thing about this is a lot of times in your system, right, you can say, yes, include first name. But then there's also an option where it says, well, what do you want the default to be if the first name is missing? And people will skip that, and that's the thing that will burn you. Like taking 2 seconds to make sure it does say Dear Friend instead of Dear Dynamic Tag, right? First name in curly cues, because I didn't take 2 seconds to make sure the default wasn't a default, right? As soon as I get that, I'm like, you failed at personalizing, which is more damaging than if you would have just left my name off. So again, it's usually lurking there. It would take you an extra 15 seconds. So just don't skip that step because it will definitely come back to bite you in the butt. So just real quick, a couple of resources to share. So again, there's a lot out there. As I mentioned, there's this one that's from MailChimp, and it's a guide. Email marketing for nonprofits. It's a free guide. They have a ton of other things on there that you can dig into, but this is just a great place to like get you connected into their guides and resources section because their stuff really is user-friendly. It's easy to digest. It makes total sense. So another one, this is just a good, there's some good resources here for sure, but again, just a nice blog. Again, continued learning, this nonprofit marketing guide, Kivy LaRue Miller, like she's a great speaker, trainer, lots of really good resources. So some specifics around email, but just in general, nonprofit marketing, she's a good resource to go to. M&R benchmarks report. So this is one that we at NTEM, we partner with M&R to do this every year. But it's been going for 10 years. So there is a lot of data over time. And again, they really dig in. So around email, but around other sort of digital benchmarks. So in this one, you can dig into some things like, well, what are the benchmarks and norms for arts and culture organizations versus advocacy versus, so you can get into the real granular. So this is, again, another free report, but this one has a ton of useful data and goes out to a pretty large sample set. So I think it's pretty solid information. So again, last few things. As you're heading out, these are some things to keep in mind. You know I give you a lot of information and it's easy to feel overwhelmed. I would say, as you're thinking about Give More 24, separate campaign emails and strategies and plans from what are ongoing long-term ones. You will handle them differently. There's different frequency, there's different messages, right? Like your newsletter might have 2 or 3 sections or something like that. Campaign-focused emails, it needs to be focused on that campaign because that's where you want your people focused for a short period of time. You can get back to getting them into your newsletter and all your other stuff after, but if you want them to be focused, make sure you stay focused. Like anything, tools are tools, but they're best used in combination together, right? Like I'm at an Ad Person event, email's a great way to keep me hooked and continue after we all leave this physical space. Just some other ones here, right? It's your through line. Before, during the event, after. This is your personal way to stay connected and to loop in and support everything you're doing on your social channels and all this kind of stuff. And you've heard this now, so hopefully it sticks how important it is, testing. Even just that base level of send yourself the test example of what an HTML and the plain text version looks like. Because people don't always realize, like, oh, I put this URL in and I link to this text, and then in the plain text version, this thing suddenly looked horrific. Oh, I just needed to clean this up or change it a little bit. Or I completely relied on these visual graphics to tell my story in the HTML version. So guess what? In the plain text, there's no story. There's no information. It's totally missing. So just 2 seconds to make sure those 2 things are actually looking like you want them before you schedule that thing up. And then obviously, you can get to some cool stuff with A/B testing, optimization, all this kind of stuff. If you want to go there, let me know. But in general, please at least send the test email. So again, here's this. They'll share it. I've dug in on a lot of tools. I can go to a lot of nerdy levels on different stuff. So feel free to please take advantage. I'm super happy to get emails to say, that's great. I would check out these 2 resources to save you some time instead of you digging through. I will search Google, email bulk platform, and you can send me an email and be like, instead of digging through 20, here's the 3 I've found over the years are really good, or they have great customer support, or they have a pricing structure that's actually fair for nonprofits, that kind of stuff. So definitely let me know. I'm happy to connect up and support. And now you get a little break, because again, we went over a few more minutes with spillover, so I'll let you catch your breath. But thanks for coming and sharing your time with me.